July 18th, 2023. It's another warm summer day in the East Cleveland suburb of Bedford, Ohio.
On the east side of Cleveland, people say there's a lot more diversity, a lot of different ethnicities. There's a little bit of everybody, different walks of life, and so lots of culture.
Bedford is more urban, suburban area. It's quieter, and it's just where you will be and be safe. It is one of those places that you could move and feel some source of comfort.
But that sense of comfort and safety has turned to panic for the family of 25-year-old up-and-coming rapper, Bernicia Lightfoot.
No one has seen or heard from Bernicia in 2 days.
This was unusual, out of character, and it was more than just, she's busy, so she hasn't reached out, or she's just not in the mood to talk.
And her birthday was that week, so a lot of people was looking forward to being with her.
Nisha, please call me back.
Just like we can't find Bernicia, and I'm really scared for Nisha.
Gary, have you or Jay heard from Bernicia?
We all, I think, knew that it was something bad. We all had bad feelings, It wasn't like she just disappeared for a couple hours or a night, It just felt bad.
No, I'm at the studio right now and she's not here.
I really think something bad about to happen to her.
At 25 years old, Bernicia Lightfoot was determined to make her mark on the music industry.
Her energy was crazy. She worked hard, but Nisha, she's a beautiful soul, a lovely person. She's a happy person. I ain't never seen her with an attitude, never seen her talk down on nobody.
She was probably one of the brightest lights I ever met. She was funny, she was witty, and she did light up a room for real. Everybody loved her.
However, Bernicia had faced plenty of adversity in her life.
She had faced a lot of loss, a lot of death in her life.
She lost her mother at a very young age and then turned around and lose her father. Then she lost her brother.
But all that loss propelled her to try and make a change.
She actually joined the Wolfpack Gunshot Response Team, which was founded to train civilians how to do some preliminary tending to gunshot wounds.
She had a good spirit about herself and, the wherewithal to want to help somebody else.
Bernicia also used her music as an outlet for the tragedy she'd faced in her past.
She just had it, She'd just go in the booth and do her thing. And she could ride the beat. And she evolved mostly into, what female rappers are today.
I brought her in something to make her look like a superstar. To show her, you ain't nothing like them. You are special.
Under the name Alada, Bernicia was quickly rising up the charts as one of Cleveland's hottest new musicians.
So I'm sure to go listen to my new song, Ink, on TikTok. Show me your ink, you know what I'm saying? Let me know, show me some love, and let me know what y'all think.
The name Alada just kind of encompassed her. She was a lot of, a lot of everything, A lot of an artist, a lot of a person, a lot of sometimes a lot of a headache.
The more popular she became, the more she saw it as a way to earn the money that she never had growing up.
She was being promoted and then signed a little publishing deal for some of her songs. We went to LA and we did one show out there.
We in Cali, in a 5-star hotel, 5-star restaurants, 5-star studios. She had tailors pulling up with designer clothes, $2,000 clothes for her to try on for video shoots. She had stuff that artists don't even experience.
The aura she was giving off is that she was already a star.
Hello, everybody.
It was amazing to see it starting to come together. We were just a step or two away from really breaking out.
That's a wrap. All right, Nisha, great work.
Along her path of success in the music industry, Bernicia was meeting a lot of new people,
including a fellow music lover, 31-year-old Michael Rorty Nugent.
I've been listening to your stuff, and it's amazing.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no, you really killed it on that hook in there.
Michael and Bernicia connected over their love of music. They were both artists, and she was attracted to, his creativity.
Hey, before you leave, let's get a quick collab.
I'm game.
They did a song together.
After that, they were inseparable.
They started dating, and she's spending a lot of time with him.
He had a little bit of money. And so she probably thinking like, I probably don't got to struggle to eat. He buying me some clothes. He taking me out of town.
To everyone around her, it was clear Bernicia was smitten.
She's a lovable person. If she be into you, she actually love you. Actually cares.
But now, on the eve of her 26th birthday, no one has seen or heard from Bernicia in 2 days.
She's not answering any calls or texts, and her loved ones are becoming increasingly concerned.
Suddenly, though, there's a glimmer of hope.
Bernicia's sister, Joy, finally gets a call back from her phone.
Nisha, thank God.
But the relief is short-lived.
When she answered the phone, on the other line was a man.
Who was this?
Who is this guy? And why does he have Bernicia's phone?
Up-and-coming rapper Bernicia "Alada" Lightfoot was on the cusp of her big break.
It takes one song to really make you go, And I think she was really just banging on that door.
With her boyfriend and fellow artist, Michael Rorty Nugent, by her side, it seemed like the sky was the limit for them both.
They had a shared love of music and the potential to become this power couple in the hip-hop scene.
But on July 18th, Bernicia has gone missing, and her sister Joy has just received an alarming call from Bernicia's phone number.
Nisha, thank God.
At first, she's so relieved that her missing sister is finally calling her back.
Hello?
But when she answers the phone, it's a man on the other end of the line.
Who is this?
The man introduces himself as Fred Levine.
Yeah, I just found this phone. I was just hoping you could help me find the rightful owner.
The phone was locked. However, Fred was still able to see missed calls from the lock screen. He dialed the first number that showed up on her phone.
Yeah, it's my sister's phone and I need it back ASAP. Where are you?
Joy immediately makes arrangements to meet with Fred and obtain the phone.
Hi, I'm Joy.
Fred, nice to meet you.
Where's the phone?
Is this Fred guy trustworthy, or could he have something to do with Bernicia's disappearance?
Where'd you find it?
It was laying in an alleyway by my apartment complex.
He found Bernicia's phone on the corner of 59th and Chester Avenue. This is still the east side of Cleveland, but it's more than 10 miles from Bedford.
That's so strange.
Yeah.
What was Bernicia's phone doing over there?
Well, thank you for your help.
Of course. I hope you find your sister.
With Bernicia's cell phone now in tow, Joy heads straight to Cleveland PD to officially report her sister missing.
You ready to get some water or something?
No, I can't eat or drink anything right now.
All right. You have her phone, you said, right?
Joy gives detectives the phone in hopes they can unlock it and use it to locate her sister.
I can't get into that phone. I tried everything. My mother's death day, I tried my mother's birthday, my father's death day, my father's birthday, her birthday. Her birthday is tomorrow.
It is tomorrow. How old?
She's 26.
Detectives ask Joy about the last time she spoke to her sister.
I called Teresa Sunday at 5 o'clock. She called me, and she was just calling just for regular, what you doing? And I'm like, nothing, I'll go there. She said, oh. And I was like, all right, well, I'll see you tomorrow. I'll call you tomorrow, son. I gotta go home and get ready for work.
All right.
Okay, love you.
According to Joy, Bernicia seemed completely normal. There was no cause for alarm at that time.
No distress or nothing. If there was anything going on, I'm telling you, Bernicia, text me, call me, know my number by heart.
Okay.
Joy says the location where Bernicia's phone was located is another cause for concern.
On 59th and Chester, like an alleyway.
Okay.
Across the street from the park.
Okay.
Why would it be over here? She don't know nobody over here.
Okay.
There's no reason for it to be over here.
All right.
According to her family and her friends, it's not an area that she frequented.
Based on everything they're hearing from Joy, investigators agree there's good reason to be concerned about Bernicia's well-being.
We have good phone numbers for you guys, and we'll contact you with any updates, okay?
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for coming in.
At the end of the interview, detectives officially list Bernicia as a missing person, and they hand over the phone to forensic analysis in hopes that they can crack open the phone.
In the meantime, detectives follow up on any other possible lead to Bernicia's whereabouts.
Detectives reach out to Fred.
After speaking with him, they don't think he had anything to do with Bernicia's disappearance or knows where she is now. He's just a guy who found a phone.
They checked all the local hospitals, and she hadn't been reported as being admitted or treated at any of those places.
Everybody was banging the streets trying to find her, or see what's going on.
In speaking with some of Bernicia's friends, investigators learn a vital piece of information. She'd recently started dating someone new.
They learn about her boyfriend, Michael Roy Nugent, and that she'd recently moved in with him.
However, detectives' calls to Michael go unanswered.
No one seems to know where he is. Has Michael gone missing too? Or did the couple take a last-minute getaway together?
With both Bernicia and Michael unaccounted for, the next step for detectives is clear.
It was enough to raise suspicion enough for the police to want to go to the apartment and do a wellness check.
All right. Okay, thank you.
They went to the apartment, knocked on the door, but no one was there, so they reached out to management to open the door.
Once inside, detectives come face to face with an unsettling scene.
The house is disheveled. There are things everywhere. It looks like the apartment has been ransacked.
But it's in the kitchen that investigators make the most concerning discovery of all.
There's a large stain by the stove.
Does that look like blood to you? I mean, it looks like it's burnt.
Right in the kitchen, there's blood all over the floor, dried blood.
More than 48 hours after she was last seen, Bedford police are conducting a welfare check at the apartment of 25-year-old Bernicia Lightfoot. But as police enter the dwelling, they uncover something alarming. A large pool of blood on the kitchen floor.
Does that look like blood to you? I mean, it looks like it's burnt.
Right in the kitchen, there's blood all over the floor, dried blood.
Does this look like an outline of something?
The blood was also kind of shaped in the way of an arm. It was just kind of one of those scenes that you knew, hey, what happened here? Someone was seriously hurt.
Did you see that?
Yeah, like an arm or a leg, maybe?
Dude, I don't know. I don't like the looks of that. I don't see a trail anywhere else in here.
The blood had been mopped or wiped with a towel. They did find a towel that was drenched in blood and had cleaning solution on it.
That answers the question of why did it look black and burnt? When you're mixing blood and some sort of cleaning solution over time, that's what it will look like. The cleaning solution and the blood had mixed together and became that dark colored, dried element on the floor.
Investigators locate the cleaning solution on the counter, and right next to it is a knife.
However, investigators don't think the knife was the only weapon used in the violence that transpired here.
There was a bullet hole in the stove.
and several other bullet holes throughout the area.
There were more than 6 shots.
They don't locate a gun anywhere in the apartment, but it's clear a gun was fired multiple times.
But was the victim Bernicia, Michael, or someone else? And where is the couple now?
They found his wallet and they found her purse. And both of their IDs were in those respective places.
So police are thinking this probably wasn't a robbery until they find the drugs.
Police find cocaine hidden in the refrigerator and pills that later tested positive as methamphetamines. Now they're considering, could this have been a drug deal gone wrong?
It was just a lot of unanswered questions, from the crime scene to the drugs and the wallet still being there.
In their search for answers, detectives turn to the couple's neighbors. One man says he didn't hear any gunshots, but he did have an unsettling story to tell.
One neighbor reports seeing something very suspicious the night before.
Around midnight, I heard some noise outside, so I looked out the window.
He remembers hearing someone like dragging something. He peeps out of his window and he sees some guys and this black bag.
He saw them trying to put it in the back of the vehicle, and they was having trouble shutting the hatch on the vehicle, and then they finally got it shut and they drove off.
Detectives immediately wonder, could there have been a body in that bag?
It might have been that size.
He mentioned to police, like, yeah, it's possible it could have been a body in there. The way that it was kind of like long and wrapped up.
Did you get any identifying information on the vehicle?
The dark color SUV.
Unfortunately, the neighbor didn't get a license plate number, and he didn't recognize the SUV or the men.
But he knows there were 3 men total, including the driver of the SUV.
There were 2 black males and 1 white male.
Could one of those individuals have been Bernicia's boyfriend, Michael Rorty Nugent?
Detectives must consider the possibility that Michael did something terrible to Bernicia, but there's also the possibility he's another victim in this.
Back at the station, detectives continue pushing for leads on the identities of the 3 mystery men.
Could they have targeted the couple for drugs?
But as detectives continue mulling over that theory, they learn they have a visitor.
Absolutely. We'll be right there.
It's one of Bernicia's closest friends, Kenza Jackson.
She says, hey, I have some information that you might need.
And what Kenza says will turn the case on its head.
That's when she tells police that Michael had been abusing Bernicia.
You literally got the gun pointed at his pipe. I'm not going.
Ohio detectives investigating the mysterious disappearance of Bernicia Lightfoot are sitting down with her close friend, Kenza Jackson. And Kenza has just made a startling claim about Bernicia's boyfriend, Michael Rorty Nugent.
She says Michael had been violent towards Bernicia.
She starts spilling the beans, explaining who he was, saying how they had a very abusive relationship, and she saw it firsthand.
In fact, Kenza says she didn't approve of the relationship from the start.
That's because just a few months before Bernicia started dating him, Michael had been released from prison. He spent 3.5 years in prison for abusing the mother of his child.
A couple years ago, he needed to take him under to post him there. You know what I'm saying? Okay. So when he got out and he started talking, I'm like, no, I didn't prove it. I see Nisha like a little sister to me.
In fact, Michael was initially supposed to have a longer prison sentence for his misdeeds against his ex.
He got out of prison because he was beaten by the guards or something, and then he got a settlement.
He got $115,000, and he blew a lot of that money on drugs.
Got out of jail, he got a big lump sum of money. I ended up hopping over the code and
messed him up.
It became strange, like, you do tabs, you do code, you do all of that. It was crazy, like a switch.
This explains the drugs police found inside his apartment.
Whether it's drugs or alcohol, whether you're selling or using, those cultures lend to violence.
Kinza says before long, it was clear Michael's violent tendencies hadn't been reformed during his stint in prison.
About a month into their relationship, she had called me to come pick her up. So I'm like, cool. And that was the first time he put his hands on her.
Bernicia was very distraught, and she left for a couple of days, but after that, she went right back to Michael.
Yeah, I was low-key mad. She went back. I said, you go back. Just think about the funeral.
Yeah.
Because he don't love you.
We see this a lot with domestic violence victims. The abuser has a certain control over them that keeps them coming back.
And according to Kinza, the relationship became more and more volatile.
There was one evening in which Kinza and Bernicia were getting ready to go out for a girls' night.
But the night was soon ruined by Michael.
We getting dressed, about to leave. He come in the house, he's like, where you think you going? Pulled out this long ass, looked like a Western gun or something. He was literally at the house in Bedford holding us in their house. He got the gun pointed at us like, y'all not going.
And when Bernicia tried to protest, Michael took his aggression a step further.
Come on, Michael. I don't have time for this tonight.
Michael got very upset with Bernicia, and he picked up a liquor bottle and he hit Bernicia in the head with it.
Didn't I tell you? I told you.
I was hearing stuff from the streets that she was getting beat. He was doing crazy stuff that she's not gonna definitely let me know. I'm like, this is not right. Come on, this guy the devil.
Despite the increasing abuse, Kinza says Bernicia never pressed charges against Michael.
Bernicia never went to police. She just kind of threw it by the wayside.
She was a victim, and I think she got too deep into it, but she really couldn't turn.
You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You know, adults have choices. They have, free will. Unfortunately, she chose to stay.
But he changed her all the way around. Her rap started changing. She started talking about demon time, and that's what he's talking about. He talking about he's a demon.
Michael became a prime suspect at that point. They were trying to reach out to him, couldn't get an answer, didn't know where he was.
With Michael and Bernicia still nowhere to be found, family and friends continue the search.
People were trying to put together some type of search party.
They was being detectives, like they was finding out things, they was in the streets.
She had, her sister, her best friend, everybody was, calling around, trying to find her.
But on July 21st, police finally received the lead they've been desperate for.
On Friday morning, police receive a 911 call, and it's from Michael's mother.
This is Bedford Heights. I have a 911 transfer for you. She states that she believes her son killed his girlfriend. She doesn't know where the body is, but he is at her house right now.
Yes, it's everything she just said.
She stated that my son is here. He said he did something bad, and he's in the room asleep right now.
Does he know you're calling? No, he's asleep. He's fell asleep. So I guess he's tired.
And did he tell you that he did this? He confessed to you that he did it?
Yes.
Police immediately raced to her home. They all went over there, guns drawn.
He had nowhere to go. It was a matter of time.
What's your name? Are there any guns in here?
Ohio police on the hunt for murder suspect Michael Rorty Nugent have just learned that he's hiding out at his mother's house.
He confessed to you that he did it?
Yes.
Investigators swiftly move in to make the arrest.
They had to assume that he had the weapon, so yeah, they came in full SWAT gear.
Sure enough, he was back there in the back room, sleeping like a baby, as if nothing happened.
What's your name? Are you naked or you got drawers on? You got anything on you? Is there any guns in here? Roll over.
He starts complaining that his foot is broken.
How'd your foot break?
I think he was kind of dazed.
Regardless, detectives take Michael out in handcuffs and place him under arrest.
There's nothing on you, right, bro? Nothing at all on you? No, okay.
Back at the station, detectives confront Michael about Bernice's disappearance.
He initially said, I don't know where she is. I don't know what could have happened to her.
However, detectives aren't buying it.
Police knew that he knew something and he wasn't telling the whole truth.
We want to recover her body for her family, and if you could help us do that, we'd be more than appreciative.
How you know she's dead, man?
Because that was arterial blood on the floor.
She was carried out in a bag.
When it finally started coming to a head, he was getting emotional.
Can you tell us where she's at? Or can you take us to her?
That had nothing to do with that. I didn't do it. You didn't do what? You didn't move her body, or you didn't do anything? I was not there.
With Michael stonewalling the conversation, detectives put one final offer on the table.
They tried to, help him come clean with letting him know, if you help us, basically we'll help you.
This interview's being recorded, and the sooner you go, dude, yeah, we got into it, something happened. I'm gonna show you right now where she's at. Or tell us. That's what a judge wants to see.
I don't know what happened. I don't know none of that, man. I wasn't there. I didn't do it, man. That's all I know.
Then just to let you know, you're gonna be charged with aggravated murder in 2 days. And that we will be stacking up mountain evidence against you. And you're gonna go to prison for a long time. If you decide you want to talk to us, you can. Reach out to us.
Detectives keep Michael in holding and circle back around to his mother.
They called his mother and said, hey, he's not telling us the full story. Can you come down?
Fortunately, she agrees to aid the police in the investigation of her son.
Let's start at the beginning. He knocked at your door. What time was it?
At 2:30 a.m.
She says she knew that something wasn't right.
I knew right then, like, what the hell?
Right.
So I had that gut feeling that I knew something was up.
She directly asked him, was Bernice dead?
I'm like, where is she? What happened? I'm like, is she dead? Like, did you kill her? He said, I shot her 3 times. I was shocked.
When she found out that Bernice's life ended, she felt enough conviction, despite it being her son, to call the police and say, hey, you need to come get him.
And with his mother now turned state's witness, it seems Michael is feeling the heat.
Detectives get word from Michael. He's finally willing to take them to Bernice's body.
After denying culpability in the disappearance of his girlfriend, Bernice Lightfoot, Michael Rorty Nugent has finally decided to come clean.
He finally admits, okay, I know where she is, and I'll take you to her.
On July 21st, just 4 days after she was last seen, Michael leads police to a small wooded area in East Cleveland, Ohio.
He's right over there.
When they find her body, Bernicia has multiple gunshot wounds in the head, back, and arm. It was overkill.
Michael also admits he stashed the murder weapon nearby.
You buried the gun somewhere along in here?
Yeah, it's right over there.
He was able to take the police right to where the gun and the bullets were located. It was a .44 mag.
The bullets in the gun were in close quarters. They were feet apart, but the gun was buried. The bullets were not.
He just threw it where he could. And it just amazes me how he just led police to everything.
If you really love her, why would you allow her to stay out there? And I think that kind of played on his psyche, made him, come to the reason that I should go ahead and finish this thing.
When the news spreads to Bernicia's loved ones, it's a devastating blow.
When they did find her, it hit me, It was like, wow, it was tough. And Jay was distraught because he's known her since she was a little kid.
She didn't deserve none of that. Like, she was working on herself. She was getting better. And it's sad. It's so sad. It's just her. I still think about it. It's mind-blowing. It hurts so bad.
With Bernicia's remains finally accounted for, authorities take Michael back to the station to give his confession.
We still need to know what led up to this. How did this happen?
Michael says it all started on the night of July 17th.
I pick up her phone, was online.
Michael, for some reason, went through her cell phone and discovered that she was talking to another male who was intending on picking her up that night.
Who's this?
He's just giving me a ride. It's no big deal.
Why are you lying?
Bernicia told him that it was just in her words, a hood Uber.
I know she ain't doing know what to do. It's just like, it's weird. Like, you make a lot of us that she used to get the spaz and trying to get the phone. She was concerned, like, you ain't start touching her.
He says that's when Bernicia picked up a knife, the same knife that was in the kitchen that police took in for evidence.
Just give me my phone back.
Yo, put the knife down.
From there, Michael says it became a fight for his life.
He was trying to say it was in self-defense.
She just kept coming at me. I grabbed my gun. I just told her, please put the knife down. We're going too far. And she turned the knife around like she was about to stab. And I just banked into the refrigerator and she just shot 3 times.
He shot her, and then he shot her again and again.
You know where it hit her? I didn't look where it hit her. I knew she was dead.
He said she came after him with a knife, but who's to say that's true or not?
After that, Michael says he attempted to clean the crime scene.
He says he wrapped Bernicia's body up and drove it to the wooded area.
Who'd you call to help you? Hey, I have any help. You got her outside by yourself? Yeah. Is that how you hurt your ankle? Yeah.
But there was actually 2 other individuals that was involved he didn't tell on. That right there is the kind of scary part. We don't know who these other 2 individuals were, and they're still out there somewhere.
Michael says after he hid Bernicia's body and the gun in the woods, he got rid of her phone.
You left it up there in our little apartment right there by like 59, by that park? Yeah. Nowadays, it's kind of shocking and somewhat a miracle. Somebody found it was trying to get back to it because most folks be trying to make some money off it. Yeah.
After hearing Michael's confession, detectives aren't so sure he's telling them the full truth.
Detectives aren't buying Michael's story. They don't believe he killed Bernicia in self-defense. His version of events doesn't match up with the evidence from the crime scene.
Detectives believe this wasn't an act of self-defense, but a murder soaked in cold-blooded jealousy.
He met a beautiful young lady. He felt he struck gold. Different labels looking at her, music getting out there, people hearing, people contacting her, doing features with her. But she started finding out he was a fraud. And that's where all the fatal attraction stuff really started happening.
Investigators surmise that after enduring abuse at the hands of Michael for so long, Bernicia had finally had enough.
I heard she was getting ready to leave him. She wanted to leave, she didn't want nothing to do with him. She left him the first time for a month. And I think the second time, he knew that she wasn't gonna come back.
Michael, I'm leaving you. Michael, did you hear me? I'm leaving you.
Who is this?
I think he was dealing with some mental health issues and plus drugs, and he saw that she was going to meet some guy.
That was it. That was the end of it.
She was looking for love, but she found it in the wrong place.
For confessing to the crime and leading police to Bernicia's body, Michael is granted a plea deal.
It was determined that it wasn't premeditated, it wasn't aggravated. The plea deal that he ended up taking was he was to be convicted of involuntary manslaughter, of tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse.
There was no trial, nothing of that sort, which is actually a good thing because to drag the family through a trial, that would have been very devastating.
As part of Michael's plea deal, he's sentenced to just 23 years in prison. And to many of Bernicia's loved ones, that just doesn't seem like enough. He'll be eligible for parole in December of 2045.
When he get out, he still can see the light of day. It's like basically the system is wicked to me because you showing everybody like, oh, you can kill and still get out. You could cold-blooded murder and still get out. He took a good person, an innocent person, away from the family. He shortened her life and he gets to still walk through. I don't understand that.
I have to, as a prosecutor, believe that rehabilitation is possible or my job is pointless. Without rehabilitation, there's no hope and there's no need for a prison system. But do I think that this family needs more than 23 years to forgive Michael? I think they need a lifetime.
These days, Bernicia Alada Lightfoot lives on in her art, in those she connected with and the love she shared.
She was on her way of defying the odds, just trying to do something in her life, trying to pursue music.
I used to tell her, like, you're a star. Look at yourself like that. You deserve better. But at the end of the day, what she really wanted was love. What she really wanted was somebody to sit there and love her.
I just think that she would have really made an impact in the entertainment world. I think the world would have seen somebody at the top of their craft, really putting some great music out.
We got a big picture in our studio of her, and I just look at her now, now I just look at it just to motivate me. Like, yeah, you still with me. You right here with me.
Abuse is never okay. If you or someone you love is in an abusive relationship, there is help available. Call the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE.
Before the courtroom, before the prison sentence, before federal agents began pulling apart records and private messages, there was a young man standing beneath the lights of Detroit City Hall. His name was Kwame Kilpatrick. He was 31 years old when Detroit elected him mayor in 2001, and when he took office in January 2002, he carried with him the kind of story that political campaigns are built around. He was young. He was energetic. He was charismatic. He represented a new generation in a city that desperately wanted to believe in a new beginning. Detroit had been through decades of industrial decline. Factories that had once made the city a symbol of American manufacturing had closed their gates. Neighborhoods had lost businesses, families, and jobs. The city was fighting financial pressure, aging infrastructure, and uncertainty about its future. Into that landscape came a young mayor who appeared to understand exactly what Detroit wanted to hear. He spoke about renewal, opportunity, and restoring pride. But power rarely announces what it intends to become. It begins quietly, usually behind closed doors, in conversations that seem ordinary and decisions that appear too small to matter. A contract is approved. A friend receives a phone call. A business owner is invited into a private meeting. A favor is remembered. Another favor is returned. Then, slowly, the boundaries begin to move. Years later, federal prosecutors would argue that something much larger had developed inside the government of Detroit. They would describe a system in which political influence, city contracts, private businesses, family relationships, and money became intertwined. At the center of that system, prosecutors placed the man who had once promised to help rebuild the city. Kwame Kilpatrick. The story that emerged was about what happened when public authority became entangled with private ambition, and when government allegedly began serving people who knew how to reach the person controlling it. To understand how that happened, you have to understand the city first. Detroit was built on enormous industrial power and scarred by its collapse. Its streets carried the memory of factories that had once operated around the clock. The mayor's office therefore carried enormous symbolic weight. The person sitting behind that desk was one of the most powerful figures in the city. He could influence contracts, development projects, business relationships, public services, political alliances, and opportunities worth millions of dollars. That kind of authority creates possibilities. It also creates temptation. Kilpatrick understood politics. He understood image. He understood the importance of loyalty. Around him gathered people who were not simply employees or political acquaintances, but individuals whose fortunes and ambitions became connected to his own. Among them was contractor Bobby Ferguson, a longtime associate who would later become one of the most important figures in the federal case. But in the beginning, there was no indictment hanging over their heads. There was only power, meetings, contracts, relationships, and a city watching its young mayor rise. Then came the first cracks in the image. In 2008, a scandal involving intimate text messages between Kilpatrick and a senior female aide exploded into public view. The messages contradicted earlier statements about their relationship. What might have remained a private matter became a political disaster. Kilpatrick faced criminal charges connected to lying under oath. He eventually pleaded guilty in the state case and resigned as mayor. For many people, that should have been the end. The mayor had fallen, and Detroit could move on. But behind the scandal was another investigation, much larger and far more complicated. Federal investigators had begun looking beyond the personal drama. They were interested in money. They were interested in contracts. They were interested in relationships between the mayor's office and private businesses. They were interested in what happened when government decisions appeared to benefit the same small circle of people again and again. And then investigators found something that would change the scale of the case. Messages. Hundreds of thousands of them. Approximately 300,000 text messages became part of the evidence assembled during the investigation and eventual trial. Some were direct. Others were filled with nicknames, abbreviations, private language, and references that meant little to an outsider. But investigators began connecting them. One message led to a person. That person led to a company. The company led to a contract. The contract led to money. And the money led back toward the people surrounding the former mayor. It was like watching a map draw itself one line at a time. What appeared isolated began to look connected. What looked like friendship began to look like influence. What looked like business began to look like exchange. And what looked like political access began to look, in the eyes of prosecutors, like a system. The alleged pattern was brutally simple. Political power could open doors. Contracts could create wealth. Wealth could create loyalty. And loyalty could protect political power. This was the structure federal prosecutors would eventually call a criminal enterprise. The phrase sounded almost unreal when attached to the office of the mayor of a major American city. But the case would eventually center on racketeering, extortion, fraud, bribery, tax offenses, and the alleged misuse of public authority. The deeper investigators went, the more complicated the picture became. There were contractors seeking city work, businessmen seeking political assistance, claims of cash payments and valuable benefits, and questions about the Kilpatrick Civic Fund, a tax-exempt organization prosecutors said had been used beyond legitimate civic activities. There were allegations that hundreds of thousands of dollars in income had gone unreported. There were allegations involving large amounts of cash. And there were family connections. Kwame's father, Bernard Kilpatrick, would eventually become a defendant in the federal case as well. But none of that was visible from the outside when the young mayor first walked into office. That is what makes the story so unsettling. Corruption rarely looks like corruption at the beginning. It can look like friendship. It can look like loyalty. It can look like an opportunity. It can look like someone helping a friend get a contract. It can look like a businessman making a contribution. It can look like a private flight, a dinner, a favor, a phone call. The transformation happens when favors stop being occasional and become expected, when access becomes something that can be purchased, and when contracts become pieces on a private chessboard. And when the people inside the system begin to believe that the system belongs to them. For Detroit, the consequences would reach far beyond one politician. The city was struggling financially, and residents were asking whether their government could be trusted. Every allegation carried a cost that could not be measured only in dollars. Trust was also being spent. And once trust disappears, rebuilding it can take much longer than rebuilding a road or a building. The federal investigation would eventually become one of the largest public corruption cases in Detroit's modern history. It would bring together investigators from multiple federal agencies, produce mountains of evidence, and expose private communications that had once been assumed to be hidden. It would put powerful people in the same courtroom and force jurors to examine years of relationships, payments, contracts, and decisions. And at the center of it all would be the same man who had once represented hope for a city searching for a way forward. Kwame Kilpatrick. The question was no longer whether he had fallen from power. That had already happened. The question was darker. What had been happening while he still possessed it? Had the mayor's office been used to serve the people of Detroit? Or had it gradually become the center of a private network where political influence could be exchanged for money, contracts, favors, and protection? For investigators, the answer would have to be proven one message, one transaction, one contract, and one witness at a time. For Detroit, the story would force an uncomfortable realization. Sometimes the most dangerous corruption does not begin with someone openly stealing from government. It begins with someone who knows how to make power feel personal. A handshake becomes an obligation. An obligation becomes a favor. A favor becomes a transaction. And eventually, a city government can begin to resemble something else entirely. By the time federal prosecutors stood before a jury years later, they would not present a story about one bad decision. They would present a story about a system. A system built through relationships. A system fueled by access. A system protected by silence. And at its center, they would place the former mayor of Detroit. The young politician who had entered City Hall promising renewal had become the central figure in one of the city's most extraordinary corruption trials. The lights of City Hall were there. The streets and people were still there. But the meaning of the office had changed. And now, the investigators were ready to open the door and show the public what they believed had been happening behind it. Detroit was a city that knew what it meant to lose something. Long before Kwame Kilpatrick entered the mayor's office, the city had already lived through generations of extraordinary growth, industrial power, racial tension, political battles, economic decline, and population loss. Its history could be read in the architecture, in the abandoned factories, in the empty storefronts, and in neighborhoods where houses stood close together but too many windows were dark. Detroit had once been one of the great engines of American industry. Automobiles rolled out of factories in enormous numbers. Workers arrived from across the country looking for jobs that could support a family. Entire communities grew around manufacturing plants. Money moved through the city in a way that seemed almost endless. But prosperity is not permanent. As factories closed and production moved elsewhere, Detroit began to change. Jobs disappeared. Businesses followed. Families moved away. Tax revenue declined. Infrastructure aged. Public services faced increasing pressure. By the time Kwame Kilpatrick entered City Hall, Detroit was carrying the weight of those decades. The city did not simply need another mayor. It needed someone who could convince people that the future had not already been decided. Kilpatrick was young enough to embody that possibility. He had been raised in Detroit and came from a politically connected family. His mother, Carolyn Cheeks Kilpatrick, was a prominent Democratic politician who served in the Michigan legislature and later in Congress. His father, Bernard Kilpatrick, was also deeply involved in Detroit's political world. Politics was therefore not an unfamiliar language in the Kilpatrick household. For Kwame, public life began early. He studied political science, entered the Michigan House of Representatives, and developed a reputation as an ambitious young politician. He was comfortable speaking to crowds, comfortable in front of cameras, and capable of presenting himself as both energetic and accessible. Then came the mayoral campaign. Detroiters were being asked to believe in a different kind of leadership. Kilpatrick's youth became part of his appeal. At only 31, he was far removed from the image of an aging political establishment. His campaign offered the possibility that someone from a younger generation could understand the city's frustrations and bring a new energy into government. When he won, the victory was more than a political milestone. It was a statement about what Detroit wanted to become. The young mayor walked into office carrying enormous expectations. But expectations are dangerous things. They create pressure. They demand results. And they create opportunities for anyone who learns how to control access to the person who can deliver those results. Inside City Hall, decisions were being made every day that could affect millions of dollars. Contracts had to be awarded. Construction projects had to be approved. Businesses needed permits and government cooperation. Developers needed political support. Companies competed for city work. Every decision had winners and losers. Every contract created an opportunity. And every opportunity attracted people who understood that political relationships could be valuable. This was the environment in which Kilpatrick began building his administration. At first, the machinery of government looked ordinary. Meetings. Phone calls. Briefings. Press conferences. Political negotiations. City contracts. Fundraising. Appointments. But behind the official schedule was another world, one built around personal relationships. One of the people who occupied an important place in that world was Bobby Ferguson. Ferguson was not simply another contractor hoping to win a city project. He was a friend and political associate of Kilpatrick. Their relationship would later become one of the central elements of the federal prosecution. According to prosecutors, Ferguson's businesses benefited from contracts connected to the city while Ferguson himself maintained close ties to the mayor. The alleged arrangement was not presented as a single secret deal. Instead, investigators described a pattern. A contract here. A payment there. A conversation. A favor. Another contract. Another benefit. Piece by piece, the government argued, a network had formed. The difficulty was proving that network existed. People rarely write down the sentence, "We are creating a criminal enterprise." They use ordinary words. They talk about business. They talk about friendship. They talk about politics. They talk about opportunities. And if they are careful, they avoid saying exactly what they mean. That is why the investigation would eventually become so dependent on records. The paper trail. The financial records. The contracts. The bank deposits. The tax documents. And especially the private messages. At the time, however, the public did not see the entire picture. They saw a mayor. They saw speeches. They saw political battles. They saw a young administration trying to manage a difficult city. They did not see every private conversation taking place behind closed doors. They did not know which businessmen were calling the mayor. They did not know which contractors were being discussed. They did not know how much money was changing hands. And they certainly did not know that federal investigators would eventually spend years reconstructing those relationships. For a while, Kilpatrick appeared to be surviving the pressures of office. But the political environment around him was becoming increasingly complicated. Detroit's financial problems were growing. Public confidence was fragile. The administration faced criticism from opponents and journalists. Every controversy had the potential to become larger than the original event. And the mayor's personality became part of the story. He was confident. Sometimes intensely so. He projected control even when circumstances around him were becoming increasingly unstable. That confidence could be politically useful. But confidence can also become a shield. When leaders become accustomed to having people around them who agree with them, challenge becomes dangerous. And when loyalty becomes more important than transparency, the internal culture of an organization can change. According to the later federal case, the Kilpatrick administration became a place where personal loyalty mattered enormously. People close to the mayor were positioned around important decisions. Friends had access. Associates had access. Businesses with relationships to those associates had access. The distinction between political friendship and financial opportunity began to blur. That distinction would become one of the central questions of the investigation. Where did friendship end? Where did business begin? And at what point did political influence become something that could effectively be bought? There was another important piece of the emerging story. The Kilpatrick Civic Fund. The organization had been established as a non-profit civic organization and carried the appearance of supporting community and political activities. But federal prosecutors later alleged that money associated with the organization was used for purposes that went far beyond legitimate civic work. The allegations included personal expenses, travel, housing, political activities, public relations, polling, consulting, and other expenditures. The government also alleged that Kilpatrick had received substantial taxable income that he failed to report. These allegations mattered because they suggested something larger than simple political fundraising. Money, according to prosecutors, was moving through different channels. Some of those channels looked official. Others looked private. And the boundaries between them were becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish. The more investigators examined the records, the more questions appeared. Where had the money come from? Who had provided it? Why had it been provided? Who benefited? And what had those people expected in return? These questions would eventually lead investigators toward a much broader theory of corruption. But before that happened, Detroit had to experience the consequences of political scandal in public. In 2008, the private world surrounding Kilpatrick suddenly became visible. Text messages between Kilpatrick and a senior aide were exposed. They revealed an intimate relationship that conflicted with statements Kilpatrick had previously made. The scandal became known as Textgate. It was not merely a story about an affair. The messages became important because they raised questions about truthfulness and official conduct. Kilpatrick's credibility collapsed. He faced state criminal charges connected to his earlier statements and eventually pleaded guilty. He resigned as mayor. For Detroit residents watching the story unfold, it could have seemed like the final chapter. A mayor had been disgraced. A political career had ended. The city could turn the page. But investigators were still looking. The text messages that had destroyed Kilpatrick politically were only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Federal agents were examining financial records. They were looking at city contracts. They were following relationships. And somewhere inside that enormous collection of information were the details that would eventually allow prosecutors to argue that the corruption was not an isolated collection of mistakes. It was organized. It was deliberate. And it had allegedly continued for years. The investigation was not being conducted by one person working alone. Federal agencies became involved, including the FBI and the Internal Revenue Service, along with other federal authorities. The investigation expanded. Witnesses were questioned. Records were gathered. Financial transactions were examined. People who had once operated comfortably inside Detroit's political world began to realize that federal investigators were watching. And then came the thing that would make the investigation especially powerful. The investigators had messages. Lots of them. Approximately 300,000 text messages became part of the evidentiary landscape. To an ordinary person, many of those messages might have looked meaningless. A few words. A nickname. A number. A casual reference. A short conversation between friends. But investigators had something the people who wrote those messages did not have. They had time. They could place one message beside another. They could compare a conversation with a contract. They could compare a contract with a bank record. They could compare a payment with a meeting. They could compare a businessman's claim with a message written months earlier. And slowly, the private language began to reveal a pattern. That pattern would eventually become the foundation of one of the most extraordinary public corruption prosecutions in Detroit. But the story was still far from over. The investigators had to prove that relationships were not merely relationships. They had to prove that money was not merely money. They had to prove that contracts were not merely contracts. And most importantly, they had to prove that the person at the center of this network had knowingly used the power of public office to operate it. That would require more than suspicion. It would require evidence. It would require witnesses. It would require documents. It would require the jury to look at years of conduct and see one connected structure rather than dozens of unrelated events. The city that had once placed its hopes in a young mayor was now waiting for another answer. What exactly had happened inside City Hall? And how far had the network reached? Those questions would eventually take investigators from Detroit's political offices to private businesses, from bank accounts to tax records, from contractors to family members, and from thousands of ordinary transactions to one enormous federal courtroom. But first, they had to understand the people surrounding the mayor. Because a system of power is never built by one person alone. And among those closest to Kwame Kilpatrick was a contractor whose name would soon become inseparable from the case. Bobby Ferguson. His story would reveal how political access could become a business asset, how contracts could become leverage, and how a friendship between two powerful men could become one of the most important relationships in a federal corruption trial. The investigation was about to move closer. Much closer. And when it did, the image of Detroit's young mayor would begin to change forever. Every political scandal eventually reaches a point where names stop being names and begin to become connections. A mayor is one name. A contractor is another. A businessman is another. A family member is another. On their own, each person can be explained away. A friendship can be called friendship. A contract can be called business. A payment can be called legitimate. A meeting can be called politics. But place those names beside one another, then add dates, bank records, contracts, private messages, and favors, and something different can emerge. That was the problem investigators faced when they began looking closely at the world surrounding Kwame Kilpatrick. The story was never only about the mayor. It was about the people who had access to him. It was about the people who benefited from that access. And it was about the people who understood that in Detroit, knowing the right person could be worth far more than knowing the right procedure. At the center of that circle was Bobby Ferguson. Ferguson was a contractor and a longtime associate of Kilpatrick. Their relationship mattered because Ferguson was not simply someone who occasionally appeared at City Hall hoping to win a piece of business. According to the federal case, his relationship with Kilpatrick placed him unusually close to the center of Detroit's political machinery. That closeness became important because city contracts could be enormously valuable. A construction project was not just a line on a government spreadsheet. It represented employees, equipment, materials, subcontractors, revenue, profit. And for a contractor, one government contract could lead to another. The difference between receiving a contract and losing one could mean millions of dollars. That created an environment in which access to the mayor could become an economic advantage. Investigators would later argue that Ferguson benefited from that access. The alleged arrangement was not presented as a simple exchange where money changed hands once and a contract appeared immediately afterward. Instead, prosecutors described something more sophisticated. Relationships were built over time. People became dependent on one another. Business opportunities were discussed. Political influence was used. And money allegedly moved through the network. This was one reason the case was so complicated. The government had to convince jurors that these relationships were not innocent coincidences. They had to show that the people involved understood what they were doing. And they had to show that the mayor's political authority had been transformed into a source of private benefit. Ferguson was one part of that story. Another was the mayor's father, Bernard Kilpatrick. The presence of Bernard made the case more personal. Politics had already been part of the Kilpatrick family's world for years. Kwame's mother had a significant political career of her own. His father had his own connections and business interests. Now federal investigators were examining the family's financial relationships. They were not simply asking what Kwame had earned. They were asking where money had gone. Who had received it? Who had deposited it? Who had spent it? And whether money connected to the alleged enterprise had been disguised as something else. According to the federal case, Bernard Kilpatrick eventually became a defendant himself. The allegations surrounding him were not identical to those against his son, but his presence added another layer to the investigation. It meant the story was no longer confined to the mayor's office. It had entered the family's financial world. And that world contained money that investigators considered difficult to explain. Large amounts of cash became particularly important. Cash leaves a different kind of trail from a normal business payment. A check has a name. A bank transfer has an account. A legitimate invoice has paperwork. Cash can disappear into a pocket, an envelope, a drawer, or a private transaction. But large amounts of cash can also attract attention. Investigators eventually examined evidence involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash connected to the Kilpatricks. The numbers were striking. According to prosecutors, more than $800,000 in cash was used by Kwame Kilpatrick in various financial transactions, including bank deposits, credit card payments, cashier's checks, clothing purchases, and loan payments. Bernard Kilpatrick was also alleged to have deposited more than $800,000 in cash during the period when his son was mayor. To investigators, these transactions were not merely financial details. They were pieces of a larger question. Where had the money come from? And why was so much of it moving in cash? The answer would become part of the government's broader theory. But before the courtroom, before the evidence was presented to 12 jurors, these were simply numbers being collected by investigators. A bank deposit. A payment. A transaction. A record. Another record. The government was assembling a financial map. And while that map was being built, other businesses and businessmen began appearing in the investigation. One of them was Carl Cardew. Cardew's name became significant because of allegations involving payments to Kwame and Bernard Kilpatrick. According to prosecutors, Cardew paid approximately $250,000 in cash to the two men in connection with favorable treatment involving service contracts at Cobo Hall. For investigators, the important question was not simply whether money had been paid. It was why. What was the payment purchasing? What did the person providing it expect? And what power did the recipient possess that could make such a payment worthwhile? These were the questions that transformed a financial transaction into potential evidence of corruption. Then there was John Rutherford. Rutherford became connected to the investigation through payments totaling more than $300,000 involving Kwame and Bernard Kilpatrick. The context was political and economic. Rutherford was seeking support connected to a proposed riverfront casino development. A casino project was not a small business opportunity. It represented enormous potential revenue and political consequences. For someone trying to move such a project forward, access to the mayor could be extraordinarily valuable. And for investigators, that created another question. Was political influence being exchanged for private financial benefit? The same question appeared in the case involving businessman Tony Sove. According to prosecutors, Sove provided private aircraft and other benefits worth more than $300,000 to Kilpatrick and his father. Again, the value was significant. A private aircraft is not a handshake. It is not a cup of coffee. It is an expensive benefit. And when such a benefit is provided to a powerful public official, investigators naturally want to know why. What did the person providing it want? What did the person receiving it provide in return? The government argued that these were examples of a larger pay-to-play environment. Business interests wanted something from city government. People close to the mayor could provide access. And the mayor possessed the authority to influence outcomes. But the alleged system was not limited to direct exchanges. That was what made the case difficult to understand from the outside. Money could move through organizations. Benefits could appear in different forms. People could act as intermediaries. And personal relationships could conceal the purpose of transactions. One organization became particularly important. The Kilpatrick Civic Fund. On paper, the organization had a civic purpose. It was registered as a tax-exempt social welfare organization. But federal prosecutors later alleged that its money had been used for purposes that included personal expenses and political activities. The allegations reached into the ordinary details of life. Travel. Housing. Vehicles. Clothing. Political consulting. Public relations. Polling. Security-related equipment. Expenses that, when viewed separately, might seem explainable. But prosecutors argued that when they were placed together, they revealed a pattern of personal and political spending that was inconsistent with the organization's stated purpose. The deeper investigators went, the less clean the boundaries appeared. Political money, business money, personal money, family money, public resources. They were supposed to remain separate. According to the prosecution, they had not. That distinction was central. Because the case was not simply asking whether Kwame Kilpatrick was a politician who had lived extravagantly. The government was asking whether he had used political power to obtain benefits and then used those benefits to sustain the political network that made the money possible. A cycle. Power created access. Access created contracts. Contracts created money. Money created loyalty. Loyalty protected power. And power opened the next door. That was the theory. But theories have to survive evidence. And one of the most powerful sources of evidence was already sitting inside investigators' files. The text messages. Approximately 300,000 of them. To the people who had written them, those messages had been private conversations. Some were casual. Some were emotional. Some were political. Some were cryptic. Many were probably written quickly, with no expectation that years later a federal prosecutor would place them on a courtroom screen and ask strangers to examine their meaning. But investigators did exactly that. They read them in sequence. They compared them with financial records. They matched them with contracts. They identified people. They followed references. A message that appeared meaningless by itself could become important when placed beside another document. Imagine a short text sent on a Tuesday. A meeting occurs on Wednesday. A contract changes on Thursday. A payment appears in a bank record the following week. Individually, each event could have an innocent explanation. Together, they could become something else. That was the challenge the government would eventually present to the jury. Not one smoking gun. Thousands of pieces. A mosaic rather than a photograph. And the people inside the alleged network had their own ways of communicating. Nicknames. Initials. Short phrases. Private references. Language that made sense to them because they knew the people and circumstances behind it. Investigators had to decode that language. They had to explain who was being discussed. What was being requested. What happened afterward. And whether the events matched the government's theory. It was slow work. There was no dramatic moment when an investigator opened a file and suddenly discovered the entire conspiracy. Instead, the case emerged through accumulation. One document. Then another. One witness. Then another. One transaction. Then another. That is how complicated corruption cases are often built. Not like a movie. More like archaeology. The investigators were digging through years of political activity, looking for traces of what had been buried. And as they dug, another problem emerged. The people involved did not all occupy the same position. Some had political influence. Some had businesses. Some had money. Some had family connections. Some had access to City Hall. Some had reasons to remain loyal. The network, prosecutors argued, worked because each person had something the others needed. Kilpatrick had political power. Ferguson had contracting interests. Businessmen had money and opportunities. Associates provided connections. Family members were part of the broader financial picture. The system did not require everyone to know everything. It only required the right people to understand their part. That is what made the alleged enterprise so difficult to see. From outside, it could look like ordinary politics. From inside, according to prosecutors, it functioned differently. And then came the most damaging question of all. How much money had actually been involved? Investigators were beginning to trace amounts large enough that they could not simply be dismissed as campaign expenses or ordinary political favors. The allegations involved hundreds of thousands of dollars in unreported income and substantial cash transactions. The government would eventually argue that Kilpatrick had failed to report at least $640,000 in taxable income between 2003 and 2008. That allegation added another dimension to the case. If the money had been legitimate, why had it not been reported? If the payments were legitimate business transactions, why were they being hidden? And if the benefits were political, what had been expected in return? These questions were waiting for answers. But the answers would not come quickly. The federal investigation continued long after Kilpatrick had left City Hall. The former mayor was no longer sitting behind the desk where the decisions had been made. But the decisions themselves remained. The contracts remained. The financial records remained. The messages remained. And the people who had been part of his administration could not simply erase what had already happened. The city had moved forward. Kilpatrick's political career had collapsed. But the investigation was only beginning to reveal the full architecture of what prosecutors believed had existed behind the public image. Soon, the case would move beyond financial records and private relationships. It would become a federal prosecution. The names that had once appeared in private messages would be spoken openly in court. The contracts would be examined. The money would be traced. The alleged exchanges would be reconstructed. And the former mayor would have to sit and listen as prosecutors described his administration not as a collection of political mistakes, but as an organized criminal enterprise. Before that could happen, however, investigators still needed to prove one thing. They needed to show that the people surrounding Kilpatrick were not merely people who happened to benefit from knowing a powerful mayor. They needed to show that the relationships themselves were part of the mechanism. That the favors were connected. That the payments had meaning. That the contracts had purpose. And that behind the public language of government was another language understood only by the people inside the circle. The investigation was moving toward that circle now. And at the center of it stood a young politician who had once promised Detroit a new beginning. The city had given him power because it believed he could change its future. Now federal investigators were asking whether that same power had been used to build something far more personal. Something that belonged not to Detroit, but to the people who had learned how to control access to its government. The next stage of the investigation would begin to expose how that system allegedly worked in practice. And once those details reached a courtroom, there would be no way to hide behind political speeches, campaign slogans, or carefully managed appearances. The evidence would have to speak for itself. There is a moment in every investigation when a collection of suspicious facts begins to look like something larger. At first, there are only fragments. A contract awarded to a familiar name. A payment that does not quite make sense. A businessman who suddenly seems to have access to City Hall. A phone call that happens shortly before a decision. A dinner. A plane ride. A cash deposit. A text message written in a language that only a handful of people seem to understand. Individually, each piece can be explained away. Together, they begin to form a pattern. And in Detroit, that pattern would eventually lead federal investigators to one of the most consequential corruption cases in the city's modern history. But before the FBI could explain what had happened, investigators first had to understand what was happening inside the mayor's office. Because the alleged crime was not committed in some dark alley. It was not hidden behind a locked warehouse door. It was happening around contracts, meetings, telephones, campaign relationships, businesses and government decisions. It was happening in the daylight. And according to prosecutors, the central figure was the man whose office was supposed to protect the interests of the city. Kwame Kilpatrick. In 2002, Kilpatrick entered Detroit City Hall with an image that was almost the opposite of the one that would eventually emerge in federal court. He was young. He was energetic. He was politically ambitious. At only 31 years old, he became mayor of a city that had been struggling for decades with the consequences of industrial decline. Detroit had once been one of America's great industrial engines. Factories had drawn generations of workers. Automobiles had made fortunes. Neighborhoods had grown around jobs, churches, schools, and small businesses. But by the time Kilpatrick took office, much of that old certainty had disappeared. Factories had closed. Population had declined. The tax base had weakened. Infrastructure needed money. The city needed investment. And businesses looking to operate in Detroit needed access to the people who controlled public resources. That meant City Hall mattered. A lot. Contracts mattered. Construction projects mattered. Development deals mattered. Public services mattered. Relationships mattered. And the mayor sat near the center of that entire ecosystem. That was the opportunity. But according to federal prosecutors, it was also the vulnerability. Imagine the rhythm of City Hall. Phones ringing. Assistants moving between offices. Documents arriving in stacks. People waiting in corridors. Businessmen sitting across conference tables. Contractors asking about projects. Political allies calling for favors. Staff members carrying information from one office to another. A mayor does not personally sign every decision. Power works differently. Power travels through people. A mayor can make one phone call. A mayor can ask why a particular contractor has not been selected. A mayor can express interest in a project. A mayor can influence appointments. A mayor can bring people together. And a mayor can make certain people believe that staying close to City Hall is very much in their financial interest. According to prosecutors, Kilpatrick learned how to use that machinery. The allegation was not simply that he took money. The much larger allegation was that he helped create an environment where political access could be converted into private financial benefit. It became what prosecutors characterized as a pay-to-play system. The phrase sounds almost harmless. But its meaning was not. It meant that government decisions could become part of a private transaction. A business wanted something. The political network wanted something else. A contract connected the two. And somewhere in the middle, money or another benefit could change hands. One of the most important people in this story was Bobby Ferguson. Ferguson was not simply another contractor. He was a close associate of Kilpatrick. And according to the government's case, his relationship with the mayor became one of the mechanisms through which the alleged enterprise operated. The basic arrangement described by prosecutors was brutally simple. A contractor needed city business. Political influence could help determine who received that business. Ferguson was positioned to benefit from contracts. And the government alleged that money and other benefits eventually flowed back toward Kilpatrick and those around him. It was a cycle. Power produced contracts. Contracts produced money. Money reinforced relationships. Relationships helped preserve power. And power created more opportunities. That cycle was at the heart of the federal government's case. But the story becomes more disturbing when the numbers begin to appear. Because this was not presented as one isolated transaction. There were multiple businesses. Multiple contractors. Multiple financial arrangements. Multiple relationships. And behind many of them were conversations that investigators would later have to reconstruct. One businessman became particularly important to the government's narrative. Carl Cardew. According to the prosecution, Cardew paid approximately $250,000 in cash to Kwame and Bernard Kilpatrick in connection with efforts to receive favorable treatment involving service contracts at Cobo Hall. Think about what cash means in a case like this. A bank transfer leaves a trail. A corporate payment has paperwork. A check has a name attached to it. Cash is different. Cash can move from one hand to another without announcing where it came from. It can fit inside an envelope, a bag, a briefcase, a drawer. It can disappear into a bank account later. And according to the government's evidence, large amounts of cash did exactly that. Then there was John Rutherford. According to the case presented by prosecutors, Rutherford provided more than $300,000 through payments associated with Kwame and Bernard Kilpatrick. The context was different. The interests were different. But the alleged objective was familiar. Rutherford was seeking political support connected to a proposed riverfront casino development. Again, the allegation was not simply that a businessman gave money to a politician. The prosecution's argument was that the money was part of an exchange. Access for benefit. Influence for opportunity. Political assistance for financial advantage. That distinction was critical. Because a donation can be legal. A political relationship can be legal. A businessman can support a politician. A politician can support economic development. But when prosecutors can demonstrate that something of value was provided in exchange for an official favor, the meaning changes completely. The question becomes, what was being bought? And what was being sold? Another name appeared in the government's presentation. Tony Sove. Sove was a businessman with interests in Detroit. According to prosecutors, he provided Kilpatrick and his father with access to a private aircraft and other benefits valued at more than $300,000. A private plane is not an ordinary political favor. There is something visually striking about it. While an ordinary citizen waits at an airport gate, someone with access to a private aircraft steps onto a runway. There is no crowded terminal. No long security line. No announcement over a loudspeaker. Just an aircraft waiting. And prosecutors argued that these kinds of benefits were not simply gifts between friends. They were part of a larger system. A system in which relationships could have measurable financial value. Then came the money. Lots of it. Investigators eventually examined hundreds of thousands of documents. They followed transactions. They examined records. They looked at accounts. They studied business relationships. And they began finding something that prosecutors believed was critical. Cash. According to evidence presented at trial, more than $840,000 in cash connected to the alleged extortion, bribery, and fraud scheme was used by Kilpatrick for various purposes. Some of it was deposited into bank accounts. Some went toward credit card payments. Some was converted into cashier's checks. Some was spent on clothing. Some was used to pay loans. The picture that prosecutors attempted to create was not of money sitting untouched in a hidden vault. It was money moving. Circulating. Entering ordinary life. Paying for things. Becoming harder to distinguish from legitimate income. And that was precisely the problem. Once allegedly illicit money enters the machinery of everyday life, following it becomes much harder. The original transaction may happen in one place. The benefit appears somewhere else. A payment is made weeks later. A bill is covered. A loan disappears. A purchase is made. A bank account receives cash. The investigator has to work backward. Where did it begin? Who gave it? Why? Who received it? And what did they do in return? The same question eventually reached Bernard Kilpatrick. Kwame's father was not merely a distant relative appearing in the background of the case. He was part of the government's financial narrative. Prosecutors alleged that Bernard deposited more than $840,000 in cash into his personal accounts during the period when his son was mayor. Again, the number was enormous. And numbers can sometimes tell a story more clearly than speeches. A few $100s can disappear into an ordinary day. A few thousand can raise questions. Hundreds of thousands demand explanations. Where did the money come from? Why was it in cash? Why was it deposited? What relationship did the money have to the mayor's office? And what did the people receiving it provide in return? Those questions became central to the federal investigation. But money was only one language of the alleged enterprise. There was another language. The language of text messages. By the time investigators began assembling the case, they had access to an extraordinary volume of communication. Approximately 300,000 text messages became part of the evidentiary universe surrounding the investigation and trial. 300,000. That is not a handful of incriminating messages. It is an ocean of communication. Most of those messages, by themselves, were probably meaningless. A name. A joke. A meeting time. A reference to a person. An abbreviation. A sentence that appeared completely ordinary. But investigators believed that many messages made sense only when placed beside other evidence. A text could refer to a person without using that person's full name. A nickname could stand in for a contractor. An abbreviation could conceal a transaction. A vague phrase could become significant when investigators discovered what happened immediately afterward. The investigators had to decode the language. Not simply read it. Decode it. Picture a federal investigator sitting beneath fluorescent office lights. A screen glows in front of him. One message. Then another. Then another. Thousands. Hundreds of thousands. Some are useless. Some are repetitive. Some are personal. Some are political. Some are crude. Some are deliberately vague. And every so often, a sentence suddenly connects with something else. A contract. A payment. A meeting. A phone record. A bank transaction. A witness statement. The message becomes a thread. The thread leads somewhere. And suddenly a conversation that seemed insignificant months earlier takes on a completely different meaning. That was the challenge facing the prosecution. They were not simply trying to prove that Kilpatrick knew businessmen. Of course he knew businessmen. A mayor is supposed to know businessmen. They had to show that relationships were being used as mechanisms for illegal transactions. That was far more difficult. And far more consequential. Then there was the Kilpatrick Civic Fund. On paper, the organization had a respectable purpose. It was established as a tax-exempt social welfare organization. Political figures routinely create organizations that support community activities, public causes, outreach and political work. The existence of such a fund is not inherently suspicious. But prosecutors alleged that the Civic Fund became something very different in practice. According to the government's case, money associated with the fund was used for personal and political purposes. Travel. Vehicles. Housing. Expenses for friends and relatives. Political consulting. Polling. Focus groups. Public relations. even equipment intended to protect against surveillance. The distinction was important. The issue was not whether the fund existed. The issue was whether money that was supposed to serve a public or organizational purpose was being redirected toward private interests. And once again, the investigation encountered the same question. Where did the money go? The government's case also alleged that Kilpatrick received at least $640,000 in taxable income that he failed to report between 2003 and 2008. That allegation added another layer to the story. The alleged corruption was no longer confined to contracts. It was no longer simply about political influence. It reached into tax records, personal finances, bank accounts, private spending. The boundaries between public office and private life appeared increasingly blurred. And that blurring would become one of the most important themes of the case. Because a corrupt system does not necessarily look corrupt every minute of every day. Sometimes it looks like normal life. A businessman takes a flight. A politician attends a meeting. A contractor receives a contract. A relative deposits money. A bill gets paid. A credit card balance falls. A vehicle is rented. A house is provided. A political consultant receives a payment. Each event can have an innocent explanation. The government's task was to show that the explanations were not separate. They were connected. But while the federal investigation was building, another scandal exploded into public view. And this time, it was not hidden inside financial records. It was on a phone. In 2008, intimate text messages between Kilpatrick and a high-ranking female employee became public. The messages exposed a relationship that conflicted with previous statements Kilpatrick had made about the nature of their relationship. The scandal became known as Textgate. The details were sensational. But the consequences were much larger than embarrassment. The controversy helped trigger criminal proceedings at the state level involving allegations that Kilpatrick had lied during a legal proceeding. He eventually pleaded guilty in that matter. And in 2008, his tenure as mayor came to an end. The young mayor who had once represented a new generation of Detroit leadership was gone. But the federal investigation did not end with his resignation. If anything, the departure from City Hall removed one layer of political protection and allowed investigators to examine what had been happening underneath. The city moved on. But the evidence did not disappear. Contracts remained. Bank records remained. Text messages remained. Emails remained. Witnesses remained. And investigators kept connecting them. The FBI was not working alone. Federal agencies including the IRS, EPA, and HUD became involved in different aspects of the broader investigation. That mattered because corruption leaves different kinds of fingerprints. Financial investigators follow money. FBI agents examine relationships and communications. Federal housing investigators may encounter irregularities involving public programs. Environmental investigators can uncover problems in contracts or projects. Different agencies see different pieces of the same machine. Eventually, those pieces can fit together. And when they do, a local political scandal can become a federal criminal enterprise case. The deeper investigators went, the more the alleged structure came into focus. At the center was political authority. Around it were contractors, businessmen, family members, and associates. Money moved in different directions. Favors moved in different directions. Information moved in different directions. And the same names appeared again and again. That repetition mattered. Because one transaction can be an accident. Two can be coincidence. But when the same people repeatedly appear around contracts, payments, political influence and private benefits, investigators begin asking a different question. Is this a series of isolated events? Or is it an organization? That question would eventually become the heart of the federal prosecution. The government's answer was clear. They called it an enterprise. Not merely a mayor who had made bad decisions. Not merely a politician who had accepted inappropriate gifts. Not merely a collection of businessmen who happened to know one another. An enterprise. A system. A structure in which different people allegedly performed different functions. Kilpatrick had political power. Ferguson had access to city contracts. Businessmen had money and commercial interests. Associates helped facilitate relationships. Family members appeared in the financial picture. And the flow of benefits allegedly kept the system alive. It was a machine. And according to prosecutors, the machine had one fundamental purpose: turn political power into private wealth. But there was another side to this story. The people who lived in Detroit. The contractors who competed for legitimate work. The businesses that did not have access to the right political circle. The taxpayers whose money funded city contracts. The residents who depended on public services. Every dollar diverted from a public purpose represented something more than a number in a spreadsheet. It represented a road that might not be repaired. A service that might be delayed. A contract that might not go to the most qualified bidder. An opportunity that might belong to someone else. Corruption is often discussed as if it happens between politicians and businessmen in private rooms. But its consequences spread outward. They reach people who never attended the meeting. People whose names never appear in the indictment. People who never sent a text message. People who never knew the mayor personally. That is why the case mattered beyond Kilpatrick himself. The alleged conduct was not simply about personal greed. It was about the use of public trust. And slowly, the evidence was moving toward court. The government had thousands upon thousands of pages. Bank records. Contracts. Financial documents. Witnesses. Communications. And approximately 300,000 text messages. Every message had to be understood. Every transaction had to be explained. Every witness had to be questioned. Every connection had to survive scrutiny. Because prosecutors could not simply tell a jury, "This looks corrupt." They had to prove it. Beyond a reasonable doubt. And that meant reconstructing years of activity piece by piece. Somewhere in that enormous archive, there were moments that seemed almost absurdly ordinary. A phone vibrating on a desk. A short text. A meeting scheduled for later that afternoon. A contractor waiting for a response. A bank deposit. A receipt. A contract signature. A private flight. A payment. Then another message. Another meeting. Another payment. The power of the case was not necessarily in any one dramatic scene. It was in repetition. The same pattern appearing again. And again. And again. Until coincidence became difficult to argue. By the time federal prosecutors were ready to bring their case into the courtroom, the story had transformed. It had started with a young mayor. It had passed through political scandal. It had moved into financial investigations. It had expanded into a federal corruption probe. And eventually, it became something much larger. An alleged criminal enterprise operating through the machinery of a major American city. Kilpatrick was no longer simply the mayor who had resigned in disgrace. He was now the central figure in a federal case that would ask a fundamental question. What happens when the person entrusted with public power begins treating that power as a private asset? What happens when access has a price? When contracts have a price? When favors have a price? When loyalty has a price? And when the people paying those prices begin expecting something in return? The answers would be argued in a courtroom. But before the jury ever heard those arguments, investigators still had one enormous task ahead of them. They had to turn a mountain of information into a story that 12 strangers could understand. They had to take hundreds of thousands of messages and make sense of them. They had to follow the money. They had to identify the relationships. They had to show the exchanges. And they had to prove that behind the apparent chaos was a deliberate system. Because somewhere inside those hundreds of thousands of messages was the evidence the government believed could unlock the entire case. A hidden vocabulary. A network of names. A trail of money. And the fingerprints of a political machine that, according to prosecutors, had been operating for years. The investigation was no longer asking whether something had gone wrong in Detroit. It was asking how deeply the system had been corrupted. And that question would lead investigators directly into the next stage of the story. The evidence. The suspects. The dead ends. And the painstaking hunt for the people who had helped build the machine. The investigation had begun as a search for wrongdoing. Now, it was becoming a search for the architecture of power itself. Part 5, The Discovery. Following the money. By the time federal investigators understood that the case was larger than a few questionable transactions, the investigation had already become a battle against volume. There was too much information. Too many names. Too many businesses. Too many contracts. Too many conversations. And too much money moving through too many hands. The problem was no longer finding evidence. The problem was knowing which evidence mattered. A single bank deposit could mean almost anything. A single text message could be innocent. A contract could be perfectly legitimate. A meeting between a politician and a businessman could be completely routine. But when the same names began appearing together over and over again, the routine explanation became harder to maintain. The investigators needed a map. And the first lines on that map were financial. Money has a peculiar memory. People forget conversations. People change stories. People deny meetings. People say they cannot remember what happened 5 years earlier. But a bank account remembers. A check remembers. A credit card statement remembers. A cashier's check remembers. A loan payment remembers. The numbers may not explain themselves, but they leave traces. And investigators began following those traces. They looked at deposits. They looked at withdrawals. They looked at transfers. They compared dates. Then they placed those dates beside political events and city contracts. A payment made shortly before a contract decision. A deposit shortly after a business meeting. A benefit received while a contractor was seeking city approval. A series of transactions involving people who publicly appeared to have little connection to one another. The financial records became a kind of second language. And investigators had to learn how to read it. At first glance, money moving through several accounts can look ordinary. A person receives income. They pay bills. They transfer money. They purchase something. They repay a debt. Nothing remarkable. But investigators were not looking at one transaction. They were looking at years. That changes everything. Patterns become visible. Repeated deposits. Repeated withdrawals. Repeated relationships. Repeated timing. The question was not simply, where did this money go? It was, why did this money move when it did? And who benefited when it moved? The investigation eventually focused heavily on cash. Cash was particularly important because of its ability to blur the origin of money. A large cash payment can be separated from the person who originally provided it. Once deposited, it becomes part of an account balance. Once spent, it becomes a purchase. Once used to buy a cashier's check, it becomes another financial instrument. The trail can become increasingly difficult to follow. According to evidence later presented in court, Kilpatrick used more than $840,000 in cash connected by prosecutors to the alleged scheme for various personal financial purposes. The uses were strikingly ordinary. Bank deposits, credit card payments, cashier's checks, clothing, loan payments. That ordinariness was precisely what made the evidence important. Because illicit money does not have to remain in a suitcase. It can become a pair of shoes, a monthly payment, a debt that suddenly disappears, a credit card balance that drops, a bill that no longer needs to be worried about. The money enters ordinary life. And once it does, it can be difficult to separate the legitimate from the illegitimate. Investigators also examined Bernard Kilpatrick's finances. According to prosecutors, Bernard deposited more than $840,000 in cash into personal accounts during the years his son was mayor. The number immediately raised questions. Not because cash itself is illegal. It isn't. But because investigators were trying to determine the source and purpose of the money. Why so much cash? Where had it come from? Who had given it? What relationships existed between those payments and the mayor's political activities? And why did those financial movements occur when they did? The investigation would eventually bring Bernard into the federal case himself. But before that happened, investigators needed to understand how money could move between people without appearing directly connected to City Hall. That was where the relationships became important. Bobby Ferguson was one of those relationships. To prosecutors, Ferguson was not simply a successful contractor who happened to know the mayor. He was allegedly part of the mechanism. The government argued that Ferguson benefited from city contracts because of his relationship with Kilpatrick. That relationship was valuable. Very valuable. A contractor with a powerful political ally has access that another contractor may not have. An access can translate into opportunity. A phone call can open a door. A recommendation can put a name on a list. A conversation can influence a decision. The contract itself may look legitimate when viewed alone. That was one of the central difficulties for investigators. A government contract does not come with a label saying, "This was obtained illegally." The document simply exists. It has signatures, dates, amounts, legal language, perhaps a competitive bidding process, perhaps approvals. On paper, everything may appear normal. The investigators had to prove what happened before the paperwork was completed. That meant reconstructing conversations. And that brought them back to the phones. The enormous collection of text messages became one of the most unusual features of the case. Approximately 300,000 text messages had been gathered. To an investigator, that was both a gift and a nightmare. A gift because the messages could reveal conversations that people never expected investigators to see. A nightmare because most of them were not useful. Think about your own phone. Hundreds of messages can accumulate in a matter of weeks. Multiply that by years. Now imagine trying to identify which sentences contain evidence of a federal crime. The investigators could not simply read everything and hope the truth jumped off the screen. They needed context. They needed names. They needed dates. They needed financial records. They needed contracts. They needed witnesses. And most importantly, they needed to understand the private vocabulary of the people they were investigating. People rarely write incriminating messages in perfect legal language. They use shorthand, nicknames, initials, inside jokes, half sentences, references that make sense only to the people involved. A person outside the circle sees a sentence and thinks nothing of it. Someone inside the circle understands immediately. That created another challenge. Investigators had to determine who was being discussed, what was being discussed, and why the message mattered. A nickname might refer to a contractor. A short phrase might refer to money. A seemingly innocent request might actually be connected to a contract. A meeting might be the missing link between a political decision and a financial transaction. The messages did not always explain the story. They provided fragments. The investigators had to build the story around them. And that is where the investigation began to resemble a giant puzzle. Imagine laying pieces across a table. One piece says, "Meeting tomorrow." Another shows, "A contract was approved." A bank record shows, "A large cash deposit." A witness says, "The mayor wanted this person involved." Another text message refers to a payment. Then a third record shows a private benefit. One piece proves very little. But place them together, and a picture begins to emerge. That picture was what federal prosecutors eventually called the Kilpatrick Enterprise. The government also had to examine the Kilpatrick Civic Fund. The organization presented another puzzle. Money entered the organization under the appearance of legitimate political or social activity. But prosecutors alleged that funds were redirected toward personal and political expenses. Travel, housing, vehicles, friends, relatives, polling, focus groups, public relations, political consulting, even equipment related to protecting against surveillance. The variety of expenses mattered. It suggested, according to prosecutors, that the fund was not being used for one isolated purpose. It was functioning as part of a broader financial system. And the question became, was the organization being used as intended? Or was it being used to support the lifestyle and political ambitions of the people controlling it? For investigators, the distinction between political and personal money was critical. Political organizations can spend money on campaigns. They can pay consultants. They can conduct polling. They can organize events. They can hire public relations professionals. None of those activities automatically constitute a crime. So prosecutors had to establish something more. They had to demonstrate that the money was being used improperly and that the transactions were part of a larger scheme. The indictment became a financial blueprint. It alleged that Kilpatrick had received substantial unreported taxable income. It alleged that the civic fund had been misused. It alleged that money had been concealed. And it alleged that public power had been used to generate private benefit. The financial evidence was beginning to connect with the political evidence. But there was another category of evidence that investigators could not ignore. The businesses. The contractors. The people who needed something from City Hall. Because if Kilpatrick had been operating a pay-to-play system, there had to be people on the other side of the transaction. Someone had to want something. A contract. A development opportunity. A political decision. Protection from government action. A favorable relationship. And those people could potentially explain how the system worked. They could tell investigators what happened behind closed doors. They could describe conversations. They could identify intermediaries. And perhaps most importantly, they could explain why money changed hands. That was where people such as Carl Cardew, John Rutherford, and Tony Sove became important to the prosecution's narrative. Each relationship had a different context. Each involved different business interests. But the government's argument was that they demonstrated a recurring principle. Businesses sought political influence. Benefits flowed toward Kilpatrick and his associates. And the mayor allegedly used his position to provide or preserve favorable treatment. If the jury accepted that pattern, then the case would no longer look like a collection of unrelated financial incidents. It would look like a system. There was, however, a major obstacle. The defense. Because every suspicious transaction has another possible explanation. A businessman can say, "It was a gift." A politician can say, "It was a legitimate political contribution." A contractor can say, "I earned the contract." A family member can say, "The money was mine." A friend can say, "We were simply helping each other." A text message can be interpreted differently. A meeting can be described as routine. And suddenly the investigator's neat pattern becomes an argument. That is why the evidence had to be overwhelming. Not emotionally overwhelming. Legally overwhelming. The government had to demonstrate the connection. The case was also complicated by the fact that Kilpatrick had already been publicly disgraced. The 2008 scandal had made him famous far beyond Detroit. The text message controversy had damaged his credibility. But prosecutors could not simply rely on public opinion. A jury could not convict someone because he had been a controversial mayor. The federal case had to stand on its own. The question was not, was Kwame Kilpatrick a good mayor? It was, did he commit the specific federal crimes charged against him? That distinction would matter enormously. Meanwhile, investigators continued following the money. The financial trail repeatedly led back to the same circle. City contracts. Contractors. Political relationships. Cash. Personal expenses. Family accounts. Business interests. And communications. Each category reinforced another. The text messages gave context to the financial records. The financial records gave context to the contracts. The contracts gave context to the relationships. And the relationships gave context to the political decisions. The evidence was becoming interconnected. One of the most powerful concepts in the investigation was not a specific amount of money. It was timing. Timing can reveal intention. If a businessman gives money to someone and nothing happens afterward, the meaning may be ambiguous. But if money changes hands and then a government decision suddenly benefits the person who paid it, investigators become interested. If the same thing happens repeatedly, the pattern becomes more significant. The government argued that this kind of timing appeared throughout the case. Money. Then access. Money. Then influence. Money. Then contracts. The alleged cycle repeated. And there was another element. Fear. In an ordinary marketplace, businesses compete. If one company loses a contract, another wins it. But in a political system controlled by a powerful network, a business owner may worry about something else. What happens if I refuse? What happens if I challenge the wrong person? What happens if I am excluded from future work? What happens if someone with political influence decides my business is no longer welcome? This is where the government's allegations of extortion became particularly important. The prosecution argued that the system was not simply about offering benefits. It could also involve pressure. The difference is subtle but profound. A bribe says, "Give me something and I will help you." Extortion says, "Give me something, or you may suffer the consequences." The government argued that elements of both existed within the Kilpatrick enterprise. As investigators continued, the case expanded. What had begun around one mayor became a broader investigation into Detroit's political and business culture. The FBI eventually described the investigation as lasting approximately 8 years. That is a long time. 8 years of subpoenas, interviews, financial analysis, document review, electronic evidence, court filings, witness cooperation, and repeated attempts to determine where legitimate politics ended and criminal conduct began. 8 years means investigators were not chasing one moment. They were reconstructing an era. By now, the phrase, Kilpatrick Enterprise, had acquired a specific meaning in the government's case. It described a network. Not necessarily a formal organization with offices and membership cards. Something more fluid. Relationships. Trust. Political loyalty. Business connections. Financial exchanges. Family ties. Personal friendships. And access. The people inside the network did not need to sit around a table every morning and announce their plans. Systems like this can operate through relationships. One person knows who to call. Another knows who needs to be paid. Someone else knows which contractor is favored. Someone else handles the money. Someone else arranges the meeting. Someone else provides the political cover. And the system continues. The investigation also revealed how difficult it can be to separate a politician's personal network from official government business. A mayor's friends can become contractors. A contractor can become a donor. A donor can become a business partner. A family member can become a financial intermediary. A political organization can pay consultants. A consultant can influence public messaging. Every individual connection may appear ordinary. The danger comes when all the connections point in the same direction. Toward money. Toward influence. Toward private benefit. Then came one of the most important discoveries of all. The alleged scheme was not dependent on a single source of money. There were multiple streams. Contract-related benefits. Cash. Political contributions. Business favors. Private travel. Personal expenses. Financial transactions involving family members. An alleged misuse of organizational funds. That diversity strengthened the government's theory. Because if the prosecution could show that the same people were using different methods to move value, it could argue that this was not accidental. It was adaptive. When one method was unavailable, another could be used. When a direct payment was too obvious, another relationship could carry the benefit. When cash was difficult to explain, it could be moved through accounts. When a political favor was needed, access could be used. That was the alleged architecture of the enterprise. But the deeper investigators went, the more one question remained unanswered. Who was actually responsible for directing it? Was Kilpatrick merely a politician surrounded by aggressive businessmen? Was he accepting benefits without controlling what happened? Was Bobby Ferguson acting independently? Were other people using the mayor's name to advance their own interests? Or was Kilpatrick himself at the center? That question would determine everything. Because if the government's theory was correct, Kilpatrick was not simply benefiting from a corrupt environment. He was directing it. And proving that would require more than financial records. It would require evidence of intent. Evidence that he knew. Evidence that he participated. Evidence that he understood the transactions. Evidence that the political decisions and financial benefits were connected. That was where the text messages became especially important. A single message might reveal nothing, but a sequence could reveal intent. A message before a meeting, another after the meeting, a contract soon afterward, a payment later, a reference to the same person months later, then another transaction. The investigators began seeing the same names recur. And with each recurrence, the theory became stronger. The messages were not just communication. They were timestamps. They showed when people talked, when they reacted, when they needed something, when they were worried, when they celebrated, when they tried to hide something, and when they expected something to happen. The investigators now had something they did not have at the beginning. A timeline. Not a perfect timeline. Not every conversation. Not every transaction. But enough pieces to reconstruct years of activity. And the timeline told a disturbing story. Kilpatrick rose to power. Relationships with businessmen deepened. Contract opportunities multiplied. Financial benefits appeared. The civic fund became entangled in personal and political spending. Cash moved through accounts. The Textgate scandal exposed another side of the mayor's private world. The state case forced him from office. And while the public was watching the scandal unfold, federal investigators were still following the money. The resignation did not end the investigation. It merely removed Kilpatrick from City Hall. The records remained. By the time the federal case was ready to move forward, investigators had transformed chaos into evidence. A text message could be linked to a person. A person could be linked to a company. The company could be linked to a contract. The contract could be linked to a government decision. The decision could be linked to a financial benefit. And the benefit could lead back toward Kilpatrick or someone close to him. That chain was the government's weapon. But it was also its greatest challenge. Every link had to hold. Break one link, and the defense could attack the entire chain. The city had once seen Kilpatrick as a young politician who might help rebuild Detroit. Now federal prosecutors were preparing to argue that he had used the very machinery intended to rebuild the city as a source of personal wealth. That contrast would become central to the case. The mayor's office was supposed to represent public trust. But prosecutors alleged that trust had been converted into leverage. Contracts became currency. Access became currency. Relationships became currency. Even political support became currency. And once everything had a price, the government argued, the city itself had become part of the marketplace. The investigation had begun with suspicion. It now had structure. But there was still one final piece missing. The evidence had to be taken into a courtroom. The investigators had to explain the code. The prosecutors had to explain the money. Witnesses had to explain the relationships. And 12 jurors would have to decide whether the enormous collection of messages, contracts, financial records, and testimony represented something far more serious than political misconduct. They would have to decide whether Kwame Kilpatrick had built a criminal enterprise. And before that verdict could ever come, the government needed to cross the most difficult bridge of all. From suspicion to proof. The next stage would reveal the breakthrough that turned years of investigation into a case the government believed could withstand a federal jury. Because somewhere inside those hundreds of thousands of messages was the thread prosecutors believed connected everything. And once they pulled that thread, the entire structure began to unravel. Part 6, The Investigation. The names behind the network. The most difficult part of a corruption investigation is rarely finding a suspicious transaction. It is proving what the transaction meant. A payment can have an explanation. A contract can have an explanation. A political favor can have an explanation. Even a friendship can have an explanation. But when all of those things begin appearing together, investigators start asking a much more dangerous question. Who was connecting them? That question became central to the federal investigation surrounding Kwame Kilpatrick. Because prosecutors were no longer looking at isolated acts. They were looking at relationships. And relationships are where criminal enterprises either reveal themselves or disappear. By this point, the investigation had already been running for years. The FBI had accumulated enormous quantities of material. The IRS was examining financial records. Other federal agencies were looking into different aspects of Detroit's contracting and governmental activity. The volume was intimidating. Boxes of documents. Digital records. Bank statements. Contracts. Emails. Phone records. Text messages. Witness interviews. And names. Hundreds of names. But among those names, certain ones appeared repeatedly. Kwame Kilpatrick. Bobby Ferguson. Bernard Kilpatrick. Businessmen seeking city opportunities. Contractors. Political associates. People connected to the Civic Fund. People who had reasons to remain close to the mayor. The investigators began drawing lines. Not literally at first. But eventually, the case began to look like a network map. One name in the middle. Several names surrounding it. Lines representing contracts. Lines representing money. Lines representing communication. Lines representing political influence. And some of those lines seemed to cross again and again. The government's theory was becoming clearer. Kwame Kilpatrick had political power. Bobby Ferguson had a contracting business. Businessmen needed access to Detroit's government. And money or other benefits allegedly moved between them. But the defense had an obvious response. Knowing someone does not make you guilty. Receiving a political contribution does not make you guilty. Awarding a government contract does not make you guilty. Even accepting a gift does not automatically prove a federal crime. So investigators needed something more powerful than association. They needed evidence showing coordination. Evidence showing intention. Evidence showing that the relationships were not accidental. That was where the communications became critical. The 300,000 text messages were not a single smoking gun. There was no magical message that said, "We are now committing a federal racketeering offense." Real conspiracies rarely speak that clearly. People communicate in fragments. They assume other people understand. They use nicknames. They use shorthand. They leave things unsaid. Sometimes they deliberately avoid explicit language. And that meant the investigators had to learn the social world behind the messages. Who was Bobby? Who was being discussed? What did a certain abbreviation mean? Why was a particular person suddenly mentioned after a government decision? Why did a conversation become urgent after a contractor received a contract? Why did someone ask about money immediately after a political meeting? The words alone were not enough. Context gave them meaning. Imagine a detective looking at a message that simply reads, "Did you take care of that?" On its own, it means almost nothing. It could refer to dinner, a meeting, a phone call, a document, a bill, 1,000 ordinary things. Now place that message beside a city contract. Suppose the contract was awarded the next day. Then suppose a financial transaction occurred shortly afterward. Suddenly the message becomes interesting. Not proof by itself, but interesting. That was the nature of the investigation. It was built from connections. The federal government was trying to show that apparently ordinary communications became incriminating when placed inside the larger sequence. And then there was Bobby Ferguson. Ferguson became one of the central figures in the government's case because his relationship with Kilpatrick appeared to bridge politics and business. A contractor close to the mayor can occupy an extraordinarily powerful position. The contractor knows the political decision-maker. The political decision-maker knows the contractor. Other businesses know the contractor knows the mayor. And suddenly the contractor becomes a gateway. Want to reach City Hall? Know Bobby Ferguson. Need something from the administration? Talk to someone close to Bobby. Need a contract? Understand who has influence. That is the kind of structure prosecutors described. Not necessarily a formal hierarchy. A network of access. According to the government's evidence, Ferguson benefited from lucrative city contracts. But the prosecution alleged something more. They argued that Ferguson was not merely a contractor who happened to win city work. He was part of the mechanism through which the alleged enterprise operated. Money and benefits could move through him. Political influence could be exercised on his behalf. And his business success could reinforce the power of the network. The relationship between Ferguson and Kilpatrick therefore became one of the most important relationships in the case. If prosecutors could demonstrate that the mayor helped Ferguson obtain contracts in exchange for financial benefits, they would have established one of the clearest examples of the alleged pay-to-play system. But proving that connection required witnesses. And witnesses could be unpredictable. A businessman who once depended on political access may suddenly decide that cooperating with investigators is safer than remaining loyal. A contractor